High winds and wet green wood turned John Hooper's execution into the most gruesome horror spectacle of the age, a slow 45-minute roasting. He remained conscious through the torture, beating his breast with a charred hand until his arm literally dropped off, screaming for more fire, just to end the agony. It was a scene from hell, where a quick death became a luxury that the executioner coldly refused to grant. This brutal display was how the Tudor regime asserted its new absolute power, crushing the old feudal order under the weight of sheer violence. But the executioner made a fatal calculation. Instead of silence, Hooper's defiance became the absolute 0 point of a revolution, his burnt corpse serving as the very first brick that would build the massive empire of Puritanism in the centuries to come. John Hooper was born around 1495 in the Green Hills of Somerset. The England of his childhood was not just a Catholic country, it was a place where religion controlled everything. The church was more than a mere institution. It was the atmosphere itself surrounding everyone from birth to death. This religious power dictated daily life, deciding when people ate, worked, and celebrated. In those days, the line between religion and magic was very thin. Priests claimed they could turn bread and wine into the actual body of Christ just by speaking Latin words. It was seen as a miracle that could be performed whenever needed. For ordinary people, religion was like an insurance policy against hell. Everyone was terrified of purgatory, a place of fire where souls were punished before heaven. Rich people built shrines and poor people bought candles to reduce their time there. It was a business deal. You gave the church money and they promised you safety in the afterlife. Hooper grew up in this system and did very well. His family was wealthy enough to send him to Oxford, the best university in the country, where he graduated in 1519. At this time, Hooper was not a rebel at all. He was a traditional man who followed the rules and accepted the church's authority completely. He eventually became a Cistercian monk, likely living in a quiet abbey in Gloucester. These monks were known as the White Monks and followed strict religious rules. By his 20s, Hooper shaved his head and wore heavy wool robes. He dedicated his entire life to poverty, silence, and obedience to the church. For years, Hooper lived a quiet life of constant ritual. He walked the monastery halls and chanted prayers, playing his small part in the great religious machine of England. He spent his days praying for the dead, completely unaware that the world outside his walls was about to change forever. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther had taken a hammer to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The shock waves took time to cross the English Channel, but they arrived. They came in the form of smuggled books, merchants hiding pamphlets in bales of wool, scholars whispering in the back rooms of taverns. Then came the King's Great Matter. Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir and lusting after Anne Boleyn, decided to break the English Church away from the Pope in Rome. It is crucial to understand that Henry was not a Protestant. He hated Martin Luther. Henry wanted to be his own pope. He wanted the rituals, the incense, and the Latin Mass. He just didn't want the Vatican taking his taxes or telling him who he could marry. In the late 1530s, Henry unleashed the dissolution of the monasteries. It was a wholesale plunder of epic proportions. The king's men rode out, seizing the vast wealth of the abbeys, stripping the lead off the roofs, melting down the gold chalices, and evicting the monks. Hooper was cast out. The sanctuary of the cloister was gone. He was a man without a home, a monk without a monastery. He returned to Oxford, but the silence was replaced by a roaring debate. And it was there, in the dust of the dissolved monasteries, that the white monk died, and the father of Puritanism was born. At Oxford, the atmosphere was electric and dangerous. To read the works of the Swiss reformers, Huldrych Zwingli and Heinrich Bullinger, was to risk death. These men went much further than Luther. Luther believed Christ was still present in the bread and wine. Zwingli argued that the Eucharist was a memorial, a remembrance. Do this in memory of me. For Hooper, this was the key that unlocked his mind. He began to read. He read voraciously. He looked at the rituals he had performed for years, the bowing to statues, the lighting of candles, the prayers to saints, and he saw them suddenly not as holy rites, but as idolatry. He saw them as a barrier between the human soul and God. He wrote later of this transformation, "I was a courtier and a monk, but when I read the writings of Bullinger, I saw the truth." It wasn't a gentle conversion. It was a violent restructuring of his reality. If the Mass was a lie, then millions of souls had been misled. If purgatory was a fiction invented to sell indulgences, then the Church was a thief. Hooper was not a man who could do things by halves. He couldn't just kind of believe. If it was true, it required total submission. But England was becoming a graveyard for men with such thoughts. In 1539, King Henry VIII, growing old, paranoid, and conservative, passed the Act of 6 Articles. It was known as the Whip with 6 Strings. It reaffirmed the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, the celibacy of priests, and the necessity of confession. The penalty for denying the first article was death by burning. No recantation allowed. Hooper was now walking a tightrope. He left Oxford and took a job as a steward in the household of Sir Thomas Arundel. Arundel was a powerful man, a traditionalist, but a man of honor. He liked Hooper. He admired his intelligence and his efficiency. But you cannot hide a fire in a basket of straw. One day, Arundel walked in on Hooper or engaged him in conversation. The details are lost to the fog of time, and realized that his steward was a heretic. Arundel was placed in a terrible position. To harbor a heretic was treason, but he didn't want to see Hooper burn. So he devised a plan. He would send Hooper on a mission to the Bishop of Winchester, Stephen Gardiner. Stephen Gardiner. Remember that name. He was the Wolf of Winchester. He was the most brilliant, cunning, and ruthless conservative politician of the age. Arundel hoped that Gardiner, with his sharp legal mind, could debate Hooper back into the safety of the Catholic fold. It was a disaster. Hooper arrived at Winchester House. Gardiner, likely expecting a meek, confused scholar, found himself face to face with a man of unyielding intellect. They argued for days. Gardiner tried to use tradition and church law. Hooper parried with scripture. The tension in the room must have been suffocating. Gardiner was not used to being contradicted, certainly not by a former monk. He realized that Hooper was not just confused. He was a dangerous radical. He was sacramentarian, the worst kind of heretic who denied the physical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Gardiner began to lay the trap. He smiled, he nodded, but the machinery of the state was beginning to turn. Arundel, realizing his mistake, sent word to Hooper, "Run." Hooper knew the game was up. Gardiner's agents were everywhere. The ports were watched. England was an island prison. Here, we see the resourcefulness that often gets overlooked in the stories of his piety. Hooper didn't just pray for a miracle. He made one. He fled to the coast. He couldn't travel as a scholar or a cleric. That would be suicide. So the former Cistercian monk acquired a set of rough clothes. He dressed himself as a sailor. Some accounts suggest he even assumed the role of a ship's captain or a boatswain, adopting the rough slang and the rolling gait of a man of the sea. It was a desperate masquerade. Imagine the tension as he walked the docks, perhaps at a southern port like Rye or Dover, negotiating passage to France. Every glance from a customs officer could mean the stake. Every question about his cargo could reveal his ignorance. But he pulled it off. He hired a boat and slipped across the channel to France. He made his way to Paris, but Paris was no safe haven. France was deeply Catholic. He continued on, moving through Strasbourg, until he finally reached the promised land of the Reformation, Zurich. If England was the past, Zurich was the future. Under the guidance of Heinrich Bullinger, Zurich had been scrubbed clean of the old superstitions. The churches were plain, whitewashed, devoid of statues and gold. The focus was entirely on the Word of God. For Hooper, this was utopia. He spent nearly a decade here. He learned Hebrew. He debated theology with the greatest minds of Europe. And he did something that would have been a death sentence in England. He fell in love. Her name was Anna de Cercles. She was a refugee herself from the Low Countries. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, a priest or monk marrying was an abomination, a violation of a vow made to God. To Hooper, it was a holy act, a rejection of the devil's doctrine of celibacy, which he believed led only to corruption and secret sin. They married. It was a partnership of equals. Anna was intelligent, devout, and brave. She knew that by marrying Hooper, she was tying her fate to a target. They lived in relative peace, but Hooper's eyes were always turned toward England. He watched as Henry VIII grew fatter, sicker, and more tyrannical. He watched as the fires burned in Smithfield. He waited. Then, in January 1547, the news broke across Europe. The tyrant was dead. Henry VIII had died. His son, the 9-year-old Edward VI, was king, and Edward was being raised by Protestants. The doors were open. The exiles could return. Hooper began to pack. He was no longer the young monk who had fled in a sailor's disguise. He was now a man in his 50s, hardened by exile, sharpened by debate, and radicalized by the freedom of Zurich. He was coming back not just to participate in the English church, but to tear it down and rebuild it from the foundations. He said his goodbyes to Bullinger. He looked at the safe, clean streets of Zurich one last time. He made his prophecy about burning to ashes. And then John Hooper boarded the ship that would take him home and toward the most controversial, explosive, and agonizing years of his life. He was bringing the fire of the Swiss Reformation to London, and he had no idea that the sparks he struck would eventually consume him. As the coastline of England rose from the gray mist of the Channel, Hooper knew he wasn't just bringing his family and his books back home. He was bringing a match. The years of quiet exile were over. The theoretical debates in Swiss libraries were about to become visceral, street-level conflicts in English cathedrals. The monk was dead. The radical had arrived. London, teeming, restless, and starving for direction, had no idea what was about to hit it. The collision between the man of granite and the politics of the court was inevitable, and the sparks from that impact would soon ignite the entire nation. When John Hooper stepped off the boat in London in May 1549, he did not step into a calm harbor. He stepped into a hurricane. England was in the throes of a chaotic adolescence. The old king, Henry VIII, was dead. The new king, Edward VI, was a fragile, precocious boy of 11. The country was being run by a council of regents, led by the king's uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. It was a time of rapacious inflation, social unrest, and religious schizophrenia. The monasteries were gone, but their ruins still smoked. The Latin Mass was officially out, but in the dark corners of the countryside, priests still mumbled the old rites. Into this vacuum walked Hooper. He was no longer the monk in disguise. He was a public sensation. He brought with him the cold, clear air of the Swiss Alps. He didn't just speak, he thundered. He became the chaplain to the Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector of the realm. This gave him a platform, But Hooper didn't need a title to draw a crowd. He needed only a pulpit. He began to preach at St. Paul's Cross and later in the great halls of London. He preached not once a week, but once, sometimes twice every single day, and the people of London, starved for certainty in a world of shifting shadows, flocked to him. Descriptions of Hooper from this time paint a picture of a man who had transcended normal human exhaustion. He was severe. He dressed plainly, rejecting the silks and furs of the traditional clergy. He was described by a contemporary as stern, severe, and little given to laughter. His face was gaunt, his eyes burning with the intensity of a man who has seen the absolute truth and cannot unsee it. The huge crowds loved him because he was terrifyingly honest. He didn't flatter the rich. In fact, he seemed to take a grim pleasure in flaying them alive with his words. He attacked the nobility for their greed, for enclosing common lands, and for their lukewarm faith. He told the poor that their suffering mattered to God. He told the clergy they were lazy shepherds, feeding themselves while the wolves ate the flock. Fox, the great historian of the martyrs, wrote of him, in his sermons he was perfect. He corrected the sin. He inveighed against the iniquity of the world. There was nothing in him that was not serious. He was a renowned figure, but without the vanity. He was a vessel. He was bringing the radical, stripped-down Zwinglian theology to England. He didn't want a via media, a middle way. He wanted a total cleanse, and that is where he ran headfirst into the establishment. In 1550, the king and the council decided to reward Hooper. They offered him the bishopric of Gloucester. It was a huge promotion. It meant power, money, and a seat in the House of Lords. Most men would have wept with gratitude. Hooper said no. The refusal sent a shockwave through the court. Why? Was he ungrateful? No. It was the clothes. To be consecrated as a bishop in the Church of England, the law required the candidate to wear the traditional vestments, the rochet and the chimere. To Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, these were just a uniform, useful for order, but spiritually meaningless. To Hooper, they were radioactive. He called them the livery of the Antichrist. He argued that these robes were the costumes of the Catholic priesthood, the very men who claimed to conjure God into bread. To wear them was to endorse the magic trick. It was to confuse the simple people who needed to see that the old world was dead. If the theology changed, but the costume remained the same, how would the plowman know the difference? Hooper stood before the king and the council and refused to budge. The young King Edward, who adored Hooper, was charmed by his stubbornness. In a stunning moment of royal intervention, the boy king personally struck the words, "and the saints," from the oath of supremacy, agreeing with Hooper that God alone was sufficient. But the robes were a harder sell. Cranmer and Nicholas Ridley were furious. They felt Hooper was being an arrogant narcissist, creating division over a minor issue of dress code. The debate spiraled into a political crisis. The council, exasperated by Hooper's intransigence, ordered him to stop preaching. Hooper naturally ignored them. Finally, the council lost its patience. In January 1551, the man who would be a martyr was arrested by his own Protestant government. He was sent to the Fleet prison. It was a bizarre situation. The most popular preacher in England was sitting in a damp cell because he wouldn't wear a specific shirt. For weeks, Hooper sat in the Fleet. Even his allies in Switzerland wrote to him saying effectively, "John, please, it's just a hat. Put it on so you can do the work of a bishop." Hooper, isolated and realizing that he could do no good for his flock from a prison cell, finally agreed to a compromise. He would wear the vestments only on the day of his consecration, and when he preached before the king. The rest of the time, He could wear his plain scholar's gown. He was released. On March 8th, 1551, he was consecrated Bishop of Gloucester. He wore the hated robes. He later described the experience with deep shame, feeling like a player on a stage dressed in a costume that burned his skin. But the moment the ceremony was over, he ripped them off. Bishop Hooper had arrived. If the establishment thought Hooper would settle down once he had the mitre on his head, they were delusional. He treated his diocese not as a lordship, but as a battlefield. Gloucester was a neglected region. The clergy were demoralized and uneducated. The people were confused. Hooper launched a visitation, a formal inspection of every parish in his jurisdiction. The data he collected is one of the most shocking documents of the English Reformation. It gives us a glimpse into the reality of the 16th century church that no textbook can match. Hooper examined 311 clergymen. He asked them simple questions. Can you recite the 10 Commandments? Do you know where they are in the Bible? Can you say the Lord's Prayer? The results were catastrophic. 168 of them could not repeat the 10 Commandments. 39 of them did not know where the commandments were found. 10 of them could not say the Lord's Prayer. 30 of them did not know that the Lord's Prayer was written by Jesus. Hooper was appalled. These were the men charged with saving souls, and they knew less than the children in his own household. He didn't just fire them. He didn't have the manpower to replace them all. Instead, he became a schoolmaster. He drew up a list of articles and forced the clergy to learn them. He created a superintendent system to check on them. He was relentless. He rode from parish to parish, preaching 3-4 times a day. He was a whirlwind of energy. He wrote to Cecil, the Secretary of State, "I have visited the whole of my diocese and have found such ignorance as I could not have believed." But there was another side to this Iron Man. The severe Hooper had a heart that broke for the poor. The economy was in ruins. Inflation was starving the peasantry. In his palace at Gloucester, Hooper established a custom that became legendary. Every single day his servants would prepare a massive dinner. But it wasn't for the local gentry. The gates were thrown open. The beggars, the orphans, and the destitute of the city were invited into the bishop's own dining hall. They were seated at the tables. But this was Hooper. So there was a catch. Before they ate, he would come in and examine them on the Creed and the Lord's Prayer. He fed their minds before he fed their bodies. Then he would sit with them. He didn't eat the rich food of a bishop. He ate the same plain meats he served them. For the people of Gloucester, this was revolutionary. A bishop who looked them in the eye, a bishop who shared his bread. They began to love him with a fierce protective loyalty. However, not everyone loved him. The local nobility found him insufferable. He was stepping on their toes, challenging their authority, and calling out their sins. And that brings us to Sir Anthony Kingston. Sir Anthony Kingston was the provost marshal. He was a man of violence, a local strongman who was used to getting his way. He was powerful, wealthy, and feared. He was also living in open adultery. In the old days, a bishop might have looked the other way, especially for a man of Kingston's rank. A bribe, a quiet word, and the sin would be forgotten. Hooper didn't do quiet words. He summoned Kingston to his court. He charged him with adultery and ordered him to do penance. Kingston was incensed. The audacity of this upstart preacher. Kingston rode to the bishop's palace, stormed into the chamber, and confronted Hooper. The scene was violent. Kingston reportedly beat the bishop, physically striking him, and shouted abuse at him. He threatened to kill him if he didn't drop the charge. The room must have gone silent. To strike a bishop was a grave crime. But Kingston had the sword and the men. Hooper stood his ground. He didn't flinch. He didn't call for his guards. He looked Kingston in the eye and told him that his rank meant nothing to God. He told him that his soul was in peril. He calmly informed the knight that he would be reporting this assault to the Privy Council in London. Kingston realized he had met an immovable object. The physical intimidation failed. Hooper's absolute lack of fear was more terrifying than Kingston's sword. Kingston was fined £500, a fortune in those days, and forced to do public penance. It was a humiliation. But then the twist. Kingston didn't hate Hooper for it. He watched the bishop. He saw a man who couldn't be bought and couldn't be bullied. In a world of sycophants, Hooper was real. Slowly, Kingston began to change. He listened to Hooper's sermons. He saw the charity in the dining hall. The man who had beaten the bishop became the bishop's greatest admirer. He repented of his lifestyle. He became a reformer himself. It was a victory for Hooper's tough love. He had saved a soul. But history has a cruel sense of irony. Sir Anthony Kingston and John Hooper would meet again, not in a palace, but in a market square, not as enemies, but as two men caught in a tragedy that neither could stop. In the summer of 1553, the sun began to set on the Edwardian Reformation. The young King Edward VI, the hope of the Protestants, fell ill. He coughed blood. He withered away. On July 6, 1553, the boy king died. There was a brief, desperate attempt to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, but it collapsed in days. Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, rode into London. Mary was not just a Catholic, she was a woman with a lifetime of grievances. She had seen her mother cast aside, her religion outlawed, and her own status declared illegitimate. She was on a divine mission to burn the heresy out of England and restore the authority of Rome. The storm had arrived. Hooper was at the top of the list. His friends, sensing the slaughter to come, urged him to flee. He had the money. He knew the routes to the coast. He had done it before as a young man. Hooper looked at his boots. He looked at the road that led to the safety of the sea. Then he looked at his flock in Gloucester. "Once I did flee," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the future. "But now I am called to this place and vocation, and I am thoroughly persuaded to tarry and to live and die with my sheep." He sat in his house and waited for the knock on the door. The waiting is often harder than the suffering. For days, Hooper sat in the silence of his home, listening to the world turn against him outside his window. He had made his choice to stay, effectively signing his own death warrant, but the price of that choice was now due. The silence of the house was heavy, filled with the knowledge that his shepherd's staff would soon be traded for chains. When the sound finally came, a sharp authoritative pounding on the wood, it wasn't just a summons. It was the sound of the old world coming to crush the new. The doors opened, and the long darkness began. The knock on the door came on September 1st, 1553. John Hooper was arrested and brought to London. He was not initially thrown into a dungeon. At first, the new regime played a psychological game. He was placed under house arrest, then moved to the Fleet prison, but allowed some liberties. They were hoping that the mere threat of the fire would be enough to crack him. They wanted a recantation, not a corpse. A recanting bishop was worth 1,000 dead ones. But Hooper was made of granite. When they realized he was using his time to write letters, encouraging other Protestants to stand firm, the velvet glove was removed. He was moved to the lower ward of the Fleet prison. If you want to understand the physical cost of his faith, you must visualize this place. The Fleet was built over the Fleet Ditch, which was effectively the open sewer for the city of London. Hooper's cell was located directly next to the flow of this waste. The stench was not just unpleasant, it was toxic. The air was thick with the fumes of human filth and rotting offal. For 18 months, the former Bishop of Gloucester lived in this latrine. He wrote a letter describing his condition, and It is heartbreaking in its stoicism. I have rotten straw to lie on. The chamber is right over the common sewer. The stink is so strong that I have fallen into many diseases. He developed severe sciatica. Pleurisy racked his lungs. He was in constant physical agony. The warden of the fleet, a man named Babington, was a sadist who realized he could extort money from his famous prisoner. Hooper paid for better food and bedding, but Babington took the money and gave him nothing. When Hooper complained, Babington threatened to put him in the stocks, iron restraints that would cripple him further. Hooper wrote, "He hath used me worse than a dog." Yet in this darkness Hooper shone. He turned his cell into a pulpit. He wrote treatises. He comforted fellow prisoners. He managed to smuggle letters out to his wife Anna, who had fled to Frankfurt with their daughter Rachel. In these letters he is not the severe prophet of judgment. He is a tender husband and father, apologizing for leaving them, entrusting them to God, preparing them for his death. He was rotting alive, but his mind remained razor sharp, and the government knew it. In January 1555, the waiting ended. The Marian regime had revived the old heresy laws. The burnings could legally begin. Hooper was hauled out of his cell. He was pale, limping, and emaciated, a shadow of the vigorous man who had preached twice a day. He was taken to the church of St. Mary Overy to face his inquisitors. Leading the tribunal was his old nemesis, Stephen Gardiner, now the Lord Chancellor of England. This was the showdown, the Wolf of Winchester versus the Lion of Gloucester. The trial was a piece of theater. The church was packed. Gardiner wanted a public victory. He offered Hooper a pardon. All he had to do was acknowledge the Pope as the head of the church and accept the Mass. Gardiner assumed the guise of a merciful father. He feigned concern. He told Hooper that the Queen desired his mercy. He debated him on the text, but Hooper saw the trap. He answered clearly, "The Pope is not the head of the church. Christ alone is the head." The debate turned to the Eucharist. This was the red line. Gardiner asked, "Do you believe that the body of Christ is physically present in the sacrament?" Hooper replied, "I believe that the bread remains bread and the wine remains wine." Then came the issue of marriage. Gardiner sneered at Hooper's marriage, calling it an abomination for a priest to bed a woman. Hooper retorted that marriage was honorable in all men, and that the forced celibacy of the Catholic clergy was the real source of filth in the church. The crowd murmured. Hooper was not backing down. He was attacking. Gardiner's mask slipped. He called Hooper a beast. The guards were ordered to take him away. As he was led out, Hooper looked at the faces of his judges, men he had once known, men who had turned their coats to save their skins, and he felt only pity. He was condemned as an obstinate heretic. The sentence was death by burning. On February 4th, Hooper was taken to Newgate Prison for the ceremony of degradation. This was a ritual designed to humiliate. Before the church could hand a man over to the secular executioner, they had to unmake him as a priest. They could not burn a bishop, they had to burn a layman. Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London, presided. And here lies the supreme irony of Hooper's life. To degrade him, they first had to dress him. They forced Hooper into the very vestments he had spent his life fighting against. They put the rochet on him. They put the chimere on him. They dressed him as a Catholic priest. Hooper stood there draped in the livery of the Antichrist, silent. Then the stripping began. Bonner physically ripped the vestments off him, one by one. It was a symbolic reversal of his ordination. They scraped his fingertips and his tonsure with a knife, symbolically scraping away the holy oil of his anointing. They told him he was no longer a bishop, no longer a priest, no longer a Christian. He was a branch cut off from the vine, fit only for the fire. Hooper took it calmly. He knew that no man could strip him of his standing before God. When they were finished, he was just John Hooper, a man in a ragged doublet, but he stood taller than anyone in the room. The government made a tactical decision that would backfire spectacularly. They decided not to burn him in Smithfield, the usual killing ground in London. They thought, Hooper infected Gloucester with his heresy. Let him be burned in Gloucester. Let his own sheep see him die. It will terrify them into submission. They underestimated the bond between the shepherd and his sheep. At 4 a.m. on February 5th, under the cover of darkness, Hooper was brought out of Newgate. He was handed over to 6 heavily armed guards from the Queen's Guard. They put him on a horse. The journey to Gloucester took 3 days. Hooper was cheerful. Though his body was broken by the filth of the Fleet prison, the prospect of martyrdom seemed to inject a supernatural vitality into his veins. At night, in the inns where they stopped, the guards were surprised to find their prisoner eating a hearty meal. "Why should I not eat?" Hooper told them. "I have a journey to take, and I need my strength for the fire." As they approached Gloucester on February 7th, the news of his arrival had spread. The government expected a hostile crowd, or perhaps a terrified one. Instead, a mile outside the city, the road was blocked, not by soldiers, but by people, thousands of them, men, women, and children. They were weeping, they were crying out his name. The guards were spooked. They drew their weapons, fearing a riot to rescue the bishop. But the crowd wasn't violent, they were grief-stricken. They had come to welcome their father home. Hooper was touched. He lowered his head, perhaps to hide his own tears. He was led through the familiar streets, past the cathedral where he had thundered from the pulpit, past the poorhouses he had supported. He was lodged in a house opposite the church of St. Nicholas. He was told he would have 1 day of rest. The execution was set for Saturday, February 9th, Market Day. The night before he died, 2 visitors came to see him. The first was a blind boy. The boy had walked miles to beg for the bishop's blessing. The guards tried to turn him away, but Hooper insisted. He laid his hand on the boy's head. "Ah, poor boy," Hooper said, "God hath taken from thee thy outward sight, for what reason he best knoweth. But he hath endued thy soul with the eye of knowledge and faith." It was a moment of pure pastoral care, hours before his own death. The second visitor was far more complicated. The door opened, and in walked Sir Anthony Kingston. The former adversary who had become a friend was now, by cruel twist of fate, the man appointed to oversee his death. Kingston found Hooper sitting quietly. Kingston burst into tears. He couldn't speak for a long time. Finally, he managed to choke out the words that have echoed down the centuries. He tried to persuade Hooper to recant, to save his life. "Sir," Kingston wept, "consider that life is sweet, and death is bitter, and seeing life may be had, desire it, for life hereafter may do good." It was a powerful argument. Stay alive. You can do more good living than dead. Hooper looked at the weeping knight. He smiled gently. "I thank you for your counsel, Master Kingston, but it is not friendly counsel. True it is that death is bitter and life is sweet, but the death to come is more bitter, and the life to come is more sweet." He was telling Kingston, "The fire outside is hot, but the fire of hell is hotter. I will not trade eternal joy for a few more years of breath." Kingston realized it was over. He wept uncontrollably. He told Hooper, "I thank God that ever I knew you, for God did appoint you to call me to be a child of God." Imagine the agony of Sir Anthony Kingston. He had to walk out of that room, wipe his eyes, put on his official face, and go oversee the gathering of the wood that would burn the man who had saved his soul. Hooper spent the rest of the night in prayer. He slept soundly for a few hours. The last night of John Hooper's life faded into a gray, blustery dawn. Inside the room, the prayers were finished. The tears of his friend Sir Anthony Kingston had dried. Outside, the city of Gloucester was waking up not to a celebration but to a nightmare. The time for arguments, for letters, and for theology was over. The time for the ultimate witness had begun. As the guards stepped forward to escort him, Hooper took a deep breath of the cold morning air, steeling himself for the final agonizing mile. He was walking out to meet his God, but first he had to walk through hell. It was 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, February 9th, 1555. It was market day in Gloucester. Usually the square would be filled with the noise of commerce, sheep bleating, merchants shouting prices, the clatter of carts. But today, the market stalls were silent. The business of the city had stopped. 7,000 people packed the square outside the gate of the cathedral close. They climbed onto roofs, hung out of windows, and pressed against the barriers. They had not come to see a criminal die. They had come to witness the end of a patriarch. John Hooper emerged from his lodgings. He was dressed in a gown of his host, wearing a hat on his head and carrying a staff to support his sciatica-crippled leg. He looked less like a prisoner and more like a traveler, setting out on a long hike. The government had forbidden him to speak to the crowd. They were terrified that his legendary eloquence would spark a riot. He had been told, "If you open your mouth to preach, we will cut out your tongue." So Hooper spoke with his eyes. He looked into the crowd and recognized faces. He nodded to friends. He smiled at the poor he had once fed. The crowd was weeping so loudly that witnesses said it sounded like a collective moan rising from the earth. He arrived at the place of execution. It was near a great elm tree opposite the College of Priests. The spot had been chosen carefully. It was the very ground where he used to preach. He knelt to pray. He was not hurried. The executioners, perhaps awed by the atmosphere, stood back and let him speak to God. A man nearby leaned in to listen to his prayer. He heard Hooper say, "Lord, I am hell, but thou art heaven. I am swill in a sink of sin, but thou art a gracious God and a merciful Redeemer." It was the ultimate Puritan confession. Even at the end, he claimed no righteousness of his own. He clung entirely to grace. Before he could rise, the commissioners played their last card. They placed a small box on a stool in front of him. Inside lay a piece of paper with the royal seal. It was the Queen's pardon. All he had to do was reach out his hand. If he took the paper, the chains would drop, the wood would be cleared, and he would walk away a free man. Wealth, power, and life were sitting in a box 3 feet away. Hooper looked at the box. He didn't hesitate. He cried out, "If you love my soul, away with it. If you love my soul, away with it." He treated the pardon like a venomous snake. The commissioners shrugged. They signaled for the execution to proceed. Hooper began to undress. He removed his doublet and hose. He wanted to give his clothes to the poor, but the sheriff stopped him, saying the clothes were now the property of the executioner. Hooper didn't argue. He stood in his shirt. He walked to the stake. The executioner approached with iron chains to bind his body. Hooper waved them away. "You need not trouble yourselves," he said, "for God will give me strength to abide the fire without these bands, and though I might move, I will not." He refused to be tied like a wild animal. However, the guards insisted on placing one iron hoop around his waist to hold him upright. He accepted it. Then came the gunpowder. It was a grim mercy. In the 16th century, friends of the condemned would often bribe the executioner to tie bags of gunpowder around the victim's neck or between their legs. The hope was that when the fire reached the powder, the explosion would kill them instantly, sparing them the agony of slow burning. Hooper accepted the bags. He placed one bundle between his legs and one under each arm. He looked up at the crowd. He couldn't preach, but he asked them to pray the Lord's Prayer with him. 7,000 voices joined him. The sound of the Our Father rolling across the square must have been deafening. Then the world went quiet. The executioner knelt and asked Hooper's forgiveness. Hooper replied, "Thou dost nothing to offend me. Do thine office." The torch was applied, and here the horror began. The preparations had been botched. The unseasoned timber was full of sap and moisture. The reeds they had brought to start the fire were damp. The wind was blowing fiercely, whipping around the square. When the torch touched the reeds, they didn't flare up. They smoldered. Smoke billowed up, thick, wet, choking smoke. But there was no heat. The fire hissed and sputtered. For several minutes, Hooper stood in a cloud of smoke, coughing, but unharmed. Eventually, a few flames caught, but they were weak. They licked at his feet and legs, singing his skin but not burning him. The wind blew the flames away from the stake. The fire went out. Hooper was left standing there, scorched and in agony, but fully conscious. He looked down at the men. "Have you no more fire?" he asked. "For God's love, good people, let me have more fire." The executioners scrambled. It was a nightmare scenario. They ran to fetch drier wood. They piled new faggots around him. They blew on the embers. A second fire was lit. This one caught. The heat rose. The flames reached his legs. The pain must have been indescribable. But the wind was still the enemy. It drove the flames down, keeping them around his lower body. He was not burning, he was roasting. The fire burned away his lower legs, but it didn't reach his vitals. It didn't reach the gunpowder. It didn't reach his heart or lungs. Hooper remained silent. He didn't scream. Witnesses recorded that he stood as still as the stake itself. He was praying. His lips were moving. Then the gunpowder bags exploded. But even this failed. Because the wind had dispersed the heat, the explosion was weak. Or perhaps the powder was damp. Instead of killing him, the bags merely popped. They shattered the skin under his arms and between his legs, mangling his flesh but leaving him alive. The fire went out again. The crowd was paralyzed with horror. This was not an execution. It was a torture session. Hooper was still alive. He wiped his eyes with his hands. He looked at the crowd. He was heard to say, "Lord Jesus, have mercy on me. Lord Jesus, have mercy on me." For the third time, the executioners built the fire. This time, the flames took hold. The fire finally roared up. But it had now been over 30 minutes. Hooper was in a state that defies medical understanding. He was burning alive, layer by layer. One of his arms dropped off into the fire. Yet with his remaining hand he continued to beat his breast in an act of penance. He was still praying. His lips were swollen to bursting, his tongue was black and shriveled, but the witnesses near the stake could still hear him whispering, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He did not thrash. He did not curse. He did not beg for the end. He simply endured. Finally, after 45 minutes, 3/4 of an hour in the fire, John Hooper bowed his head forward. He died, as Fox wrote, as quietly as a child in his bed. The struggle was over. The Bishop of Gloucester had walked through the fire. When the fire finally died down, there was nothing left but ash and charred bone. The crowd dispersed in a stunned silence. They had expected a show. They had been given a lesson in supernatural fortitude. The government's plan had backfired completely. They wanted to show the people that Hooper was a heretic, abandoned by God. Instead, Hooper had shown them how a man of God dies. His endurance became legendary instantly. It wasn't just courage. It was viewed as a miracle. How could a human being endure 45 minutes of roasting without screaming? The only explanation for the people of Gloucester was that God was with him in the flames. They did not see a criminal being punished. They saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. The ashes were shoveled away, but the spot where the elm tree stood became holy ground for the Protestants. The place of the green wood became a symbol of the cruelty of the Catholic regime. Sir Anthony Kingston, the man who had begged him to choose life, was never the same. He had seen the bitter death Hoopers he spoke of, but he had also seen the sweetness of Hooper's conviction. The fire in Gloucester Square eventually burned itself out. The executioners packed up their chains, and the stunned crowds dispersed in silence. The government in London, led by Queen Mary and Stephen Gardiner, breathed a sigh of relief. They believed that by turning the man into ash, his ideas would simply drift away on the wind. But they had committed a catastrophic strategic error. In the 16th century, you could kill a man, but you could not kill a book. John Fox, a fellow exile and friend of the Reformers, was watching from the continent. He began to gather the testimonies. He spoke to the people who were in the square. He collected the letters Hooper wrote from the sewer prison of the Fleet. He chronicled the botched fire, the wet wood, the 45 minutes of agony, and the superhuman patience of the victim. When Fox's Book of Martyrs was published, the chapter on Hooper became a sensation. It wasn't just a record, it was a weapon. Fox included a woodcut illustration of Hooper standing in the fire, calm and resolute. This image was seared into the English consciousness. The government wanted Hooper to be a warning against heresy. Fox turned him into an indictment of Catholic cruelty. The sheer brutality of his death, the 3 fires, the exploding gunpowder, the slow roasting, made the Queen's regime look not holy, but monstrous. People read the account and asked what kind of God requires green wood and damp reeds. And conversely, what kind of faith gives a man the power to endure that without screaming? Hooper's death did more to cement England as a Protestant nation than all his sermons combined. The bloody reputation of Mary I was forged in the embers of Hooper's stake. He had told Bullinger he would be burned to ashes, but from those ashes rose a narrative that toppled a dynasty. If Hooper's death was a victory for Protestantism, his life was the opening shot of a much longer, more complicated war, the war for the English soul. Historians often call John Hooper the father of nonconformity and the first Puritan. These are not just academic titles. They are the keys to understanding the next 100 years of British and American history. Remember the vestments controversy? The fight over the robes? To Cranmer and the establishment, Hooper was being difficult. But Hooper saw something they didn't. He saw that if the church was half Catholic and half Protestant, it would never be stable. He believed that the state had no right to dictate the conscience of the individual believer. When Hooper refused to wear the surplice, he was planting a seed. He was saying, there is a line the government cannot cross. That seed lay dormant for a while, watered by his blood. But a generation later, it sprouted. The men who followed Hooper began to call themselves Puritans. They too refused the vestments. They too refused the rituals. They too demanded a church stripped of popish trash. This movement grew. It became a political force. It crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower. It rose up in England under Oliver Cromwell. It eventually led to the English Civil War and the beheading of Charles I. John Hooper was the prototype. He was the first man to look at the English Compromise and say, not enough. Every dissenter, every nonconformist, every Puritan who later stood up to the crown could trace their spiritual lineage back to the stubborn Bishop of Gloucester who wouldn't wear a hat. And yet if you walk into a church in England today or ask a student of history, they will know Thomas Cranmer, they will know Nicholas Ridley, they might know Hugh Latimer. But John Hooper is often a footnote. Why? The answer is simple. Hooper is uncomfortable. He is not a gentle saint. He is not a nice man in the modern sense. He was rigid. He was severe. He was a fundamentalist. He lacked the poetic softness of Cranmer. Hooper's writing is sharp, direct, and often abrasive. He doesn't fit the romantic image of the Anglican via media, the middle way between Rome and Geneva. Hooper hated the middle way. He wanted the extreme way. He is also difficult because his integrity makes us look at our own compromises. Most of us, faced with the choice between wearing a silly robe and going to prison, would wear the robe. We would rationalize it. We would say, well, it's just clothes. It doesn't matter. Hooper says, no. If it is a lie, it matters. He reminds us that the slippery slope is real. He reminds us that small compromises lead to large capitulations. He is the man who draws a line in the sand and refuses to cross it, even if the entire world is screaming at him to move. That kind of personality is annoying to live with, but it is essential for survival in times of moral crisis. Shortly before he was arrested, John Hooper designed his own coat of arms. It was a common practice for bishops, but Hooper's design was not about status. It was a prophecy. The image he chose was a lamb. The lamb was placed in the middle of a thicket of sharp thorns, and above the thorns, rays of sunlight were beaming down. The symbolism is heartbreakingly clear. The lamb is the Christian, innocent, perhaps a bit helpless against the powers of the world. The thorns are the suffering, the persecution, the politics, and the fire. The sun is the glory of God. Hooper knew he was the lamb in the thorns. He didn't choose the lion or the eagle. He chose the animal that is destined for sacrifice. But there is a twist in the heraldry. The lamb in Hooper's crest is not dead. It is not cowering. It is walking through the thorns. On that freezing morning in February 1555, as the wind whipped the flames and the green wood smoked, Sir Anthony Kingston saw the reality of that crest. He saw a man who had conquered the fear of death. We live in an age of flexibility. We value adaptability. We change our profiles, our opinions, and our loyalties to fit the algorithm of the day. We are fluid. John Hooper was solid. He was a monolith in a river of mercury. His story asks us a terrifying question. Is there anything you believe in enough to burn for? Is there any truth so precious to you that you would endure 45 minutes of fire rather than deny it? For most of us, the answer is no, and that is why we need the story of John Hooper. Not because we should all be martyrs, but because we need to remember that humans are capable of that kind of transcendence. We need to know that the spirit is stronger than the flesh. The Bishop of Gloucester has been dead for nearly 500 years. His ashes were scattered by the wind, but the fire he lit, the fire of conscience, still burns. It burns in every person who says no to a tyrant. It burns in every person who values truth over safety. He was the man the fire couldn't kill. And in the end, he was right. Life is sweet, but he found something sweeter.